We are very much hoping to give some practical guidance and real kind of more nuanced understanding of the differences in regulation right now and kind of the overarching policy discussions happening in the US and the EU, and then expand also into the rest of the world because it is very relevant in this conversation. We want to get into some, understanding that most of the audience here is predominantly in XR. We are really hoping to get some practical guidance for you in that area. A lot of the regulation and conversations around the world, as you know, right now are unavoidably about AI. So we'll be talking a bit about AI regulation and how that affects the people in this room and larger development communities here. So because we have a lot of developers in the room, I'd like to, do some brief introductions before that starts, yeah? So my name is Liz Rothman. I am here with the with X Reality Safety Intelligence, xrsi.org. We are a nonprofit research organization, standards developing organization, putting together privacy and safety frameworks, and we consult with major governments and businesses in privacy and safety issues predominantly. I'm also an attorney as well. And I'm joined here with Matthew McDermott from Access Partnership, and I'll let you introduce yourself before that, Fox Bonilla as well, also with XRSI, but also here on behalf of Harbinger Creative. Matthew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks very much. Yes, my name's Matthew from Access Partnership. I've been working on policy regulation as it relates to cutting-edge technology for about 20 years, and always looking at where the new thing is going to happen next. The goal of my business is about getting that in the hands of citizens, in the hands of people, so they can benefit from new technology, but on a fair, transparent, and sustainable basis.
My name is Fox Bonilla. My background is in data visualization and software development. Started at NASA, helping executives and policymakers, kind of advising them on the state of the art, and then solutioning and creating technologies for long-duration space missions, and then now have my own company where I get called on to either incorporate XR technologies or AI technologies to optimize and just create efficiencies for large organizations, typically in aerospace, but kind of touch a lot of different industries.
All right, thank you very much for those introductions. So we have a lot of developers in the room, presumably. Can you talk to us a little bit about how regulatory efforts affect developers and innovators in this space, and what do you want people to get out of this session?
So regulatory issues can't be ignored. The strict rules like the GDPR with my EU hat on and things like the AI Act require transparency, they require a focus on safety and requirements on ethical rules baked in right from the start. So let me say that slightly differently. This is about product design. This is about how right at the beginning of the process we make products that are going to be able to go to market without any regulatory or policy barriers. I also want, in the conversation with Fox, to get a sense about where the EU and US are different, where there are similarities, and a little bit about where that's all trending, looking over the 18, 24-month horizon.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective as a technologist and a developer, just to make sure, I'd love for developers within the room and here at the conference to be aware that there are opportunities not only to influence, but also to advise on policy design and, as it relates to technology development. I think there are plenty of places for us to be able to work together and even internationally affect the way these technologies are adopted.
Great. So the first thing that we're going to do, and we've had discussions about whether to do this in slides and to really lay out what the US and the EU are doing in different capacities, but we think just a lighter conversation about the general themes of what's happening in both areas will be more productive. And if this even makes your eyes glaze over, as sometimes policy discussions do, stick around because we're going to, it'll get a little bit lighter and more relevant if this does. But first we're going to go, I'll toss to Matthew and just, can you give us a brief overview of what's happening in the EU right now?
Sure. So the big policy news has been the passage of the AI Act, which just a few weeks ago, has actually formally become law, gone through the final process. It will take about 2 years to be implemented, so a lot of people are shrugging their shoulders, waiting to see what's going to happen. The big news is around biometric data. Anything that uses personal data really is going to be more highly regulated under the European rules than in the US. As part of that, Europe's also creating an AI office, which is an entirely new organization in Brussels that will look at regulating AI, but we don't know how it's going to work. They're just staffing up now. So this is one of those situations where, as Fox was saying, there's a real opportunity to influence and guide what this looks like practically, and the Commission is still open to input from everybody.
Yeah, within the U.S., I mean, there have been several executive orders now that have been passed in the last couple of years, and conversations at the G7 around standardization and interoperability and really aligning taxonomies. And so in the United States, typically that regulation falls to each agency, and so there's been a lot of working group research within the Department of Transportation, within FAA, around the integration of AI regulation and guidance. And so, again, there are opportunities there where these working groups are often asking for industry best practices and industry insight to help define what those regulations are going to look like at the agency level.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note the differences in countries and what regulation means, what standards mean in different areas of the world, especially. So when we're talking about something like the EU AI Act that has passed through Parliament and will become law in the area, or if we're talking about in the US standards developing bodies that are coming out with with regulations that need to be followed. In some cases they're guidance, some cases they're more binding. If you go to Asia, you may have countries that are less democratic, where an actual framework that's developed by the government, somewhere like Singapore, that framework may be binding to the citizens in the country. So these conversations get a little bit sticky, and there's so much nuance in the different areas of the world, especially when we're talking about regulations, and something in the US where you may have more kind of guidance at this point, and a lot of kind of lofty goals of the White House or of different agencies, but we don't have the same level of action, I guess, at this point on kind of the regulatory issues. So a little bit more uncertainty.
And I think, I think to that point, there are opportunities there, right, where those non-binding structures provide entrepreneurs and folks in business opportunities to do things within the United States that they may not be able to do internationally. If we're thinking about VR technologies, which very easily cross borders, that's something that we all should be aware of as developers and as business owners, because the thing that might be legal within the United States immediately becomes illegal maybe in a country in Asia that has regulation that is binding.
Yeah, I know Matthew has a lot of thoughts on that. Did you?
Well, I wanted to, as you said at the start, avoid this becoming an entirely an AI discussion and look at the sort of what's called virtual worlds in the European jargon, the way they're approaching issues there. There's less regulation. It's a more softly approach, which I think is positive. I think to your point, VR is something that more easily crosses borders, although the European Commission's more interested in virtual worlds when it comes to its regulatory piece. Their policy announcements have all been about interoperability between platforms and the importance of that. They have explicitly said there are no regulatory gaps identified. The one thing they have talked about is the treatment of women and girls in virtual worlds. We can come to that later, but it becomes more of an online discussion. As with many of the virtual worlds discussions I've had in Brussels, one of my pushbacks of the Commission has been, but these are already problems, there are already rules. And in the final draft of their policy document, they are very clear that the laws that apply to the world around us apply in virtual worlds, so copyright, hate speech, and similar are things that you have to apply as well. The other thing they've talked about is education. So they're looking at putting together toolkits to help parents work with their children, how they should engage with virtual worlds, and also how to support entrepreneurs, how they can take advantage of this technology. Europe, as is often the case, sees America in the lead and doesn't want to get left behind.
So I'm going to deviate a little bit from our script for a second, which hopefully won't take us too far off. But with what you just said, though, I can't help but wonder. So a lot of the standards developing bodies, a lot of people in this room are familiar with standards developing bodies for technical reasons. And a lot of those technical standards developing bodies are right now being asked to regulate on human rights issues, or they're being asked to chime in on human rights issues, I think, broadly from what you're discussing. And what are your thoughts on that? Like how the structure of the current conversations, like in my opinion, there needs to be some division there where we're really focusing on maybe the technical interoperability standards and then also really looking at these broader human rights issues that are involved. And I don't know, Fox, do you have any thoughts on?
Well, I was going to say that I think one of the issues that affects these industries broadly as the technology is being rolled out across different sectors is the lack of standardization around taxonomies. So I think part of what we're seeing right now is reactive momentum around that standardization. And so I think in the United States, we kind of take a risk-based approach where it's a bit more reactive to what may be happening as opposed to maybe things that are happening in the EU, which are a bit more broad. These are problems that have not suddenly popped up, to your point, Matthew. These are problems that we've had and may not have been addressed. And I think this is kind of bringing them to the forefront because they are problems that potentially structurally change our society. And if they aren't addressed now, especially as these AI and XR systems start to ingest the massive amounts of data that we're producing, there's not, later is too late. And so having kicked the can down the street for as long as we have, can no longer do that, especially as an international community.
I think you're right. We can't kick the can down the road. Human rights need to be part of the broader discussion. It's about finding the level for that conversation. The OECD's done a lot of work on that, and that's at a very high level that is broadly acceptable by OECD members. But it's how you localize that and make that more detailed that becomes the challenge. Standards are a useful way of doing that, understanding what fairness looks like in certain settings. Again, you can get a group to agree around that. But I do want to talk about one situation where it can go a little bit wrong. In Europe, there's a legislation right now around child online protection. And it's very strong in protection of the child, which has broad support. Very difficult to disagree with that. But the way that the police currently ensure that children are being treated effectively online is that they are looking for images of child abuse. And the technology that's used to track that and monitor those requires them to, at some point, look at those images, which the way that the current EU law is written would become illegal, which is why the law's not been passed. It's been debated for years at this point. And it remains a sticking point as to how you create an exception for law enforcement that doesn't become an exception for the wrong sort of people. And it's this situation where the human rights angle is very clear, but how you avoid sort of externalities that were maybe unexpected by the initial drafters.
That's fascinating that there's not an exception for law enforcement.
So there's a draft, and no one can agree to it.
Okay.
And there's a cultural point, I think, which the EU-US is an example, but this is a UK-EU one. The UK's had laws around how the police can track images to protect children for many years. It's not a debate. The police should do this. Whereas in other countries with different histories of government access to data, Germany being a good example, there's more wariness about giving the police carte blanche access to children's images.
Yeah, and that issue is only getting more complicated with AI-generated content in the mix as well. So let's look at some of the kind of areas where the US and the EU do converge, if there are any right now, and then also what are some potential areas of collaboration?
Yeah, so I said previously, like at G7, there's the TTC. There are technical groups and technical functional groups that work together internationally to try to create some of that standardization. But again, to Matthew's point, the standardization is very difficult to get consensus around. And so as an international community, the struggle really is the definition of risk or the definition of the legality of certain interactions. And so there are opportunities there. There's already momentum there as well, and there has been for several years. And so it's not like we're just starting the conversation. The conversation has been started, but there is complexity around deciding the definition of words, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that some of the debates, the Hiroshima process, some of G7 processes and similar, there has been a convergence around some of the ethical questions. How those are applied remains differences of opinion, but that they exist and that there are certain answers to them is clear. The other point of convergence is around trade. People on both sides of the Atlantic want to be able to access new markets. They try to find mechanisms to do that, whether that be exceptions or some special set of rules. That we will find solutions to that in the near future, I think, is certain. It's in the interest of both sides. And if I can be cheeky in the way I answer your question, the other way of convergence is that everyone just copies the GDPR. I mean, Europe won that debate, and many global companies, rather than have many different ways of having to implement privacy rules, just do GDPR. Now, I think that's less likely with the AI Act today, but we're 2 years away from implementation, and it's plausible that there'll be a gravitational effect that pulls everyone towards the AI Act, and one that certainly I'll be keeping a close eye on in the coming months.
And so I think that brings us to the broader question. You know, we wanted to talk about the U.S. and the EU in this conversation. Specifically because a lot of developers are very concerned about GDPR, and that's one touch point that is, you know, kind of a known area on data privacy. But the larger regulatory conversation can't go without talking about the global market right now. And in this industry, you don't have borders, right, for the most part, about who's going to be using your products. And it's how can, right now, as you said, you know, GDPR was widely adopted around the world. At the moment, it doesn't seem like there's the same momentum with the AI Act. And if that will, you know, in the future, if that will be the case, we don't know. There isn't concrete regulation coming out of the US right now. How do you see the global market playing a role in this, in kind of the current landscape in a way that perhaps it hasn't over the last 30, 40 years?
So when GDPR came out, there was a desire around the world globally for better data protection. And everyone saw a solution. And you look at Brazil, Thailand, Indonesia, people copied and pasted European rules and applied them. What they found is they're quite hard to implement without quite advanced data protection regulatory authority. And as they've looked to the AI Act, everyone certainly is taking a moment to see how it's going to land. We're not seeing the copy and paste rushed activity that we did back in 2016. What we are seeing, though, is a realization that you can't just leave AI alone. A regulation is required of some description. And particularly, Japan's been quite forward in coming up with a series of principles which are very light touch and give a baseline for how AI should act in their market. And they're looking to export those and looking particularly to ASEAN as potentially a group that may adopt something similar. And what we may end up with, looking a little bit into the crystal ball here, is 3 pillars rather than the 2 of the title of this session, where you have an Asian, maybe an ASEAN conception of AI regulation alongside a US and European, and then the Scrabble will be for the rest of the world and how they look to follow.
Do you see real international cooperation? There's a lot of talk. I mean, there's even some drafts of AI treaties at this point, and international regulation on emerging technologies. There are, you know, private law groups that meet to discuss emerging technology regulation and draft rules. How do both of you? How do you view the sort of like maybe the possibility of that kind of international cooperation in the same way that we talk about nuclear like regulation, and that had been the conversation for quite a while, right, with these kinds of technologies, is we need broad international cooperation around these technologies, but I feel like that conversation has waned quite a bit. And so I wonder from your perspectives, how you feel about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is really a kind of socio-technical question, and the implications are societal at this point. And I think what countries are seeing is that if there isn't momentum toward regulation and at least standardization, there's potential for countries to completely change overnight. I mean, we're seeing it affect different sectors in the United States at a speed that is unprecedented. I mean, conversations that we're having now that we weren't having 4 months ago. And so the impetus really is to get ahead of it as opposed to being in a reactionary stance, even though a lot of countries feel that they are right now. In terms of opportunities, right, like we live in an international, in a global market. We function in that market. And if you are not communicating in a way that is accessible to other countries, you then close yourself out from entering those markets.
Yeah, and I think nobody knows that better than the people in this room, right, around developing in ways that are interoperable. And the same goes for regulation, although I don't know that we have typically thought of it that way. Right?
If I can sort of jump off from your nuclear analogy, I think, yes, there's a lot of treaties out there on AI that people are looking at, but equally, before, the reason there were nuclear treaties is that everyone had nuclear weapons. And this is happening in reverse. There were AI treaties, but a lot of countries are panicking because they want their sovereign AI. They want to be able to compete as they see it. Now, the likes of the owners of the big LLMs, the big American companies are saying, no. What you do, Spain, is you take our LLM and you build applications on top of it that are useful to your market. And that's the business proposition, and you don't need to have the investment. And then I think in some countries, certainly in medium-sized countries, that may land, but in other places, I'm thinking Saudi, UK, France, Germany, they're not going to be comfortable relying on US technology. Certainly taking the nuclear analogy. So there is this tension there between wanting treaties that keep everyone safe, wanting treaties that provide this global harmonization, at least to some extent, but desperately investing so people aren't left behind.
Yeah, well, and then the reality is even if you draft the perfect treaty, you have to get the US and China to sign it, and that's not an easy thing to do. Okay, so what other kinds of considerations, and like let's step out of this, just the, policy wonk kind of conversation of, so what other kind of considerations of competition, interoperability, I think we've touched on a few of them, even politics right now is the big elephant in all rooms. There's definitely, things sway with the wind of what his priorities are at the moment. And then standardization as well. How do these influence regulation and the conversations in the US and the EU and what people in this room should be thinking about?
I was going to say that just even having market access, right? It used to take very customized localization techniques to get your product functioning in another country because of language limitations. Now, thanks to AI, those language limitations are essentially moot. So it's interesting opportunities from a technology development side in that the thing that you're making today could easily be adopted overseas in a way that, again, wasn't possible last year even. So there are those considerations. I think also, and we've talked about this a little bit as we were preparing for this panel, just around opportunities to influence. So like everyone in this room is interested in policy development, otherwise you wouldn't be here. There are opportunities that developers may not be aware of where they can actually influence and have industry-based conversations with these regulatory bodies to help guide them in a way that is both friendly to the market, but also responsible to the constituents of those organizations.
What do you think are some of the, like in your opinion, or where you've had the most success in that area of, like, should it be the like individual professional groups of like for any given niche, or where do you go to get involved?
So for me, particularly, I mean, XRSI was one of those few early on that was developing frameworks and taxonomies that a lot of folks were not even thinking about, really kind of getting ahead of the conversation that we're having now 2-3 years ago. And so now seeing other organizations and countries talking about their own taxonomies, there's a relief that I have that, that approach is now starting to come to fruition, and there are opportunities for folks within the technology development industries to join those frameworks, to adopt those frameworks, to influence those frameworks, to help write those frameworks. And like I said, me personally, XRSI was one of those few ones in the beginning that I saw that actually already had some guidance in that space.
Yeah, we've been very proactive in that area, right, of drafting and having exactly the taxonomies and the language to discuss these issues. And but I like, so that's one thing, reach out to XRSI and get involved for sure. And then there are, of course, your own standards bodies as well, right, in your areas of development, and there are increasingly new policy groups that are popping up in those sections. So one way may be gathering peers in an area and getting kind of involved in specific areas of expertise that may not be fully fleshed out to regulators, that there may be some educational efforts that you can pursue to make sure that what you're doing is completely understood by regulators and the people that are going to control what kind of compliance requirements you'll have going into the future. What about you, Matthew, for...
Let me pick up on the market access point you made there. It's so true. It's one of the things that keeps you most busy. You can now be global, really, at the press of a button, and with only half a day's work. And that's where my point at the beginning of this presentation comes in. You've got to consider regulatory and policy from a product design perspective, because unless you do that right at the start, you can be illegal, and you can be fined, and it can go south really quickly. Just to give two examples, we worked with a client that realized 2 weeks before they were about to launch a product that it wasn't legal in one country, and they said it's fine. It wasn't legal in 2 countries. They said, we'll live with it. It wasn't legal in the US, and then then it got pulled. But it's about making sure you can do things easily and not modifying the product from a consumer user endpoint perspective. It's about how the minimal change is required to get to multiple markets. I think you mentioned what other things are impacting sort of the ability of these products to get to market. One of those is competition. So certainly around where XR and AI come together, that's an area where the Europeans are looking at very closely at this moment. There's a number of sessions and a number of reports that are coming out at the moment. And what they're focusing on is what are the competition dynamics of virtual worlds? Where do they even begin to look at this work? And they're looking at the enabling technologies, the platforms, and the services. And looking for input from people to understand that element. I think for AI, they're looking to understand what are the main sources of market power. And how they should respond to that. Part of that is a lot of European companies have done deals with US companies. Mistral, a French LLM, has done a deal with Microsoft, which was very controversial because the French government had lobbied hard in Brussels for change the AI Act for open source LLMs, lower regulation basically, to allow Mistral the opportunity to go global. We need European champions. And before the ink was even dry, Mistral did a deal with Microsoft. And did the French government know? No one is talking. But it's changed the competition mood of the debate, whereas before this had just been a deal between 2 companies. Now the Commission's looking at it, are we being taken for a ride? And there's an opportunity, I think, to influence what the outcome of that discussion is.
I'd like to add to that something we haven't really talked a whole lot about, but we're kind of approaching it from different perspectives right now, and that is the convergence, right? The convergence of XR and AI is inevitable, right? Whether it's asset generation, it's sensor suite data storage and processing, whether it's privacy and security, all of the things that we're doing will be affected by AI, no matter what sector you're in, no matter what XR product you're developing. And so I think what we're getting at is essentially that AI regulation and that discussion will affect us even if we don't want it to. And by being part of that discussion, we can actually have a say in the way that our futures are dictated, as opposed to, in the US, kind of being reactionary to some kind of regulatory consensus.
Yeah, and I think that AI is also becoming this, it is a broad umbrella term anyway, but it's becoming the umbrella term from a regulatory perspective for emerging technologies. And so I think however AI is regulated, that will trickle into the regulation of other technologies as we kind of go down the path of specific regulation there. And so it's really important to be involved in that discussion because it is seemingly for the last 2 years is the only discussion anyone has wanted to have. But it is really important to kind of understand what's happening there and the way that the technologies are being understood. And I think one of the most difficult things about AI regulation is that it has to be adaptable. It has to be flexible and adaptable in ways that we are not used to regulating technologies or anything, really. We're used to getting a clear understanding, having committees, meeting on all of these things, coming up with some clear guidelines, putting those in place, and then moving on to the next thing. And I think that all of us in this room know that that's not how emerging technologies work, right? We are constantly moving, constantly adapting, constantly having to be flexible. And you want that flexibility as developers. You want to be able to move fast and do things and understand where you may get into trouble later on if you've done something. And unfortunately, in this space, that can be very difficult sometimes. And sometimes you have to just have the 25-year-old attitude of I'm just going to push forward and do this and see what happens later, right? But all of us, I think, would prefer to have some clear guidelines, and it's a difficult request in this area. Okay, so what are some of the kind of broader implications then of the differing policy approaches right now?
I come back to my product design point. I think as you're looking at building new AI XR services, understanding how you can thread that needle if you're looking to go international is important. Or, as you're starting in the US, have half an eye to what it would look like to bake in those additional requirements that Europe would require around transparency, safety, data protection, and be ready early on, which I think my answer is cost, potentially around that. I think we will see, at least for the moment, some element of fragmentation. We've talked about global treaties, and I think there's a lot of desire for that. Where they're probably going to coalesce is going to be around AI safety. It's going to be warfare related and potentially disinformation related. I think a lot of the stuff that we're involved in on a day-to-day basis is going to be left to national governments for the moment, and that risks fragmentation. And as I was sort of thinking through this morning and attending some panels yesterday on the industrial metaverse, I realized that maybe where this comes together to begin with, maybe where this converges early on and where the trends all come together is where the data is non-personal, is where the use is with companies that have offices on both sides of the Atlantic, and where there is digital twin as one example, but industrial metaverse purposes. And maybe that's where we see the real first transatlantic use cases before we then build out into areas where there's more data protection, IP issues that are related.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And we talk about these kind of like safety issues and privacy issues that are with the collection of this data and biometrically inferred data and all of the things that kind of the scary future that we might be building towards if we don't appropriately regulate these technologies. But I do think it's important to note that regulators, especially in these digital worlds and in general right now, things like deepfakes, protection of children, those are really on regulators' minds right now. International policing agencies as well are very closely looking at those issues. And so it is such a broad area of things that we're looking at. And as developers in this room, those are areas where you should know that there's a lot of regulatory attention being paid in those areas. And so if you're developing in that space or any of your products are touching those, any spaces that children are involved in or that are developing synthetic content, it's definitely an area where you'll want to pay attention more to what's happening in that space. And maybe, again, get in and try to educate on exactly what you're doing and that there are positive use cases for those technologies beyond the kind of ones that Interpol are looking into right now for international reasons. And so I think it's, just in general, really important to keep the global view on all of these technologies and not keep your view narrow in general. But Fox, did you have?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in the U.S. specifically, we kind of take this ask for forgiveness later approach, right? So in the kind of first mover advantage of being able to collect data and process it and infer and generate content or whatever it is that your platform does, we've been in situations where, and we've seen this across social media and other technology platforms, that it's been okay to do that. I think right now what is happening globally is that there is the perception that countries don't want you to take advantage of their, or at least there's more awareness of the opportunity to take advantage of citizens in other countries internationally. And so as a technologist and a business owner, I think it's really important to be looking at compliance internationally so that that first mover advantage doesn't then cost you compliance in another country somewhere. So you've acquired all this data, you're a year ahead of everybody else, and then you can't do anything except for in the United States. And so that's a consideration that at least for your compliance offices and for your technical staff to be aware of.
So as fast as technology is moving, politics moves at an equally quick rate these days. We have a very, I think, in the European Union, in the United States, globally around the world, there's a lot of tense political situations and a lot kind of changing quickly. So let's look at we've talked about the regulatory approaches around the world right now, but let's look at kind of just some looking into a crystal ball, looking into the next kind of like 18, 24 months or so, which is impossible to predict with any certainty. But what should people be paying attention to, looking out for? Where might we sort of be going with this over the next 1 to 2 years?
Well, let me do the politics bit first. We've just gone through elections in Brussels. There's been the headlines will tell you different things. There's been a slight move to the right, but the traditional centre-ground bloc that has run politics in Europe for the last 20 years remains more or less in charge. Giorgia Meloni from Italy is the big winner. And what I've been trying to do as I was reading this over the last week is work out what it means for XR and AI and how that comes through. I think on a simple level, there's a lot of new MEPs, and they are up for grabs as to what they think about AI and where they're going to go. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and they're going to be listening to people over the next 6 months or so. The shift to the right in general means a more pro-business approach. So I think the implementation of the AI Act may not be as aggressive as it might otherwise have been, and there'll certainly be calls to smooth it slightly and attract investment. There may be a less pro-US angle to some of the discussion. I think the pro-Kremlin voices didn't do as well as was expected in the elections. But regardless, those in Italy that want more investment from China, those that want more investment from Russia are minority figures, but they have a voice. And how that plays through as we look to the safety and the warfare aspects of AI, how that plays through is going to be interesting to track, particularly if you look to a potential concerns around trade between the US and China, with Europe sort of caught in the middle, trying to understand how it plays through all that. So over the next 18, 24 months, all of that is going to evolve. We're going to see how that plays through. If I can talk about positive things, I think there is going to be further harmonization of rules around XR and around AI that will allow the ease to do business across borders. I think that's going to drive everyone forward, both at that treaty level and a more national level. I think the standards work is going to be crucial. We've talked a little bit about how that's been progressing. People are going to start to adopt those. They are going to start to use them. The interoperability piece that, to me, that makes XR really like complete game changer. More people will use that will be adopted. And I think then governments will find more use cases for it. And as there are more use cases for it, there's more investment, there's more adoption, and that virtuous cycle will continue. And I think there'll be regulatory adaptation as well. I think on both sides of the Atlantic, there'll be a realization that there are outcomes that we want to achieve regardless of regulation, and there'll be a willingness to bend a little bit to achieve the right outcomes for citizens.
I think it's very clear that we're all kind of holding our breath for November.
I would say that's accurate.
Yeah, and the influence that AI is already having on kind of disinformation and the proliferation of information in general has already been quite profound, and we're not even at the end of the summer yet. That's in the near term. I think there's already been a shift, again, kind of referencing social media, a reservation toward the institutionalization and the proliferation of these technologies across different industries. I think that the hype is not quite worn off, but there is now some reservation around the use and handling of mass data sets by LLMs that may or may not be based in this country. I think we'll start to see a bit more context around how that data is being manipulated, where it's being stored, who's responsible for it in ways that maybe we haven't seen in the past. That would be my hope. Kind of in the larger context globally, I would think that these tools, whether they're LLMs or other types of generative AIs, will hopefully give us some international context that we haven't had before. So right now we've kind of been siloed, even as countries, as large as they may be. We understand the context for our own societies, but it's going to be interesting as these tools become more powerful and receive more data inputs, to really be able to compare and contrast different technical implementations. So policymakers here no longer necessarily have to communicate on some kind of delay with someone in Asia or someone in Europe. They can use a large language model that can then potentially provide more context so that they can do some appropriate policy making that affects kind of the markets internationally.
Okay, great. So in the few minutes that we have left, let's talk about positioning in markets for the people that are here. What would you say what is your advice on staying involved, staying in these conversations? As we know, they can become all-consuming conversations, and everybody in here has your own priorities, and you're working on your own things and trying to live your lives as well, right? And so paying attention to these policy conversations is not always productive. But what can people do to position themselves to really stay compliant on top of policy and just kind of have a general, involvement and sense of what they...
Yeah, I was going to say, just, as someone from the U.S., look at what NIST is doing. NIST has working groups. They've got technical frameworks that they're creating, that are generating. The FAA, the FTC, they're all working right now to kind of set up those policies, and they're asking for industry insight. And so it's a matter of showing up. I mean, I've been at meetings where, there's been an open call for collaboration with folks like us, and 2 or 3 people have shown up. And so then you have to send another mass emailing to get more people involved. They're not trying to do it in a vacuum. And if we ignore that, we'll be, as technology makers, we'll then be reactive to the policy that we could have helped guide. So there are opportunities, lots and lots of opportunities there.
And I'll throw a plug for the Metaverse Standards Forum as well. I sit on the board of the forum there, and great work happening in many, many working groups there. So if you're not familiar, get involved with the Metaverse Standards Forum.
I'd say build strong compliance structures in from the start, involve regulatory concerns and policy concerns at the design phase. I think I'd echo the idea of joining appropriate bodies, and depending on your product and where you sit, that may be a trade association, it could be a regulatory body, to gain information. Even if you don't have the capacity to engage and have input, to know the direction of travel is really important to ensure that you're not going down a dead end. But I would add one more, which is certainly when I'm speaking on these sort of panels, the purpose is to get innovative products into the hands of users. This isn't about blocking or stopping or changing. This is about taking the sort of advice that we're providing and using it as a filter through the creativity that's in this room, to make sure that it can get to market. Because what we want to do is to enable it, not to block it. Yeah.
So do we have a couple of minutes left?
6 minutes, I think.
6 minutes? Oh, we can't
6
do
minutes questions.
Are there any questions? Is there
Mike.
a microphone somewhere?
So this question is looking way in the future, perhaps. Right now, you talked a lot about location-based regulations, and with the thought of restricting or getting everybody to agree at the regulation level. But when you get to enforcement and policy, enforcement of how you do that, particularly when one part of your virtual environment comes from one country, another one comes from a second country and a third country, which rules of enforcement and policies, or not policies, but penalties will apply, and how you're going to judiciate across all those things?
The great problem of the next decade. This is a very good point for looking forward, and we can have regulations in each of these countries, and that's why international cooperation is so important. The idea that these written rules in one jurisdiction are going to solve the problems entirely of the real world is something that everybody that's been working in virtual spaces for a long time knows is a very lofty goal, right? That will be the case. So I don't know if you guys have any specific kind of.
I would add, just as easily as you can add interactive agents into a virtual environment, you will have compliance officers, navigating the metaverse. And so AI is a double-edged sword in that regard, right? Now you have a way to scale compliance enforcement. And so to think that you can kind of skip out on it, I think people are going to be perhaps unpleasantly surprised in some cases by finding agents showing up into their environments. I mean, we're already seeing it on Zoom calls pretty often, these chatbots showing up and writing notes and making sure that there are summaries of the data that's being proliferated within a private conversation. So the fact that we will have these public synthetic spaces, it seems obvious to me that there will be synthetic regulatory agents there as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important then to look at that there are people that are legitimately developing and will be, caught out of compliance in some area, and then there are people that are scamming and have nefarious intentions, and that will be a continual problem, especially in virtual spaces, of knowing where people are actually seated when they're doing these things, if they're humans that are perpetrating these. So yeah, a continual kind of.
I mean, how you track down people, the Russians are amazing at this sort of stuff. The technology exists to find anybody, anywhere in a digital environment today. And I think the regulation and the enforcement are maybe two separate parts of the conversation. Depending on the type of country you're with, there's a cultural element, really important part of that as well. It will, to begin with, be where people sit. We're here, therefore it would be US law that would apply to the headsets that we're wearing or the worlds that we're using. But I can see laws starting to work on citizenship basis, extraterritorially, and it will be linked to the economic value of XR environments. As they become more valuable, people want to, first of all, tax them. A lot of my job is around avoiding tax, but explaining tax situations. But then there's the tracking your citizens and either protecting them or keeping tabs on them. But as Liz said, that is the next 10 years. That's going to be a really interesting debate.
Yes.
Hi. One thing I tell my clients and my students is the only difference between marketing and propaganda is what you're selling. You mentioned child pornography at the beginning, and that's something that can be directly and easily detected. But we know that, for example, TikTok influences kids in China very differently than it influences kids in the US. And we also know that social media in the US is influencing, encouraging bad behavior and other activities. Is there any historic precedent for regulations that impact or try to control culture and acceptable behavior? Has that ever been done before, or is that the new challenge?
So in the 16th century, the UK made thought crimes illegal. Didn't go down, didn't really work. It did scare a lot of people, and it did change certain behaviors. So it has been tried, and this idea of controlling society through law of some description has happened for a long time. How effective it is unclear. I think with all the news, and I speak as someone watching from overseas, but all the news about banning TikTok in the US, the user base has just gone through the roof. It hasn't really had a direct impact on that. I think that you can change culture through regulation, but it tends to come at a lower level in the engagement. I think what the European Commission's done around, so the GDPR is a good example. I'm seeing how companies use personal data in Europe evolving and how people think about it changing. And maybe if I can have one final point, it can also create an equal and opposite reaction. So in the UK is having elections right now, the UK's left Europe, and for some people that is an anti-GDPR statement, and they actively want to do the other thing. So it's changed culture in a way that is more extreme than the UK was 5 years ago because of that.
Yeah, I'd add a small point that, yeah, we've seen it in the United States. I mean, historically, it's affected entertainment, the development of entertainment in the 1950s. We've seen it restricting certain kinds of content being shown on television in the 1980s. This isn't a new problem. It may be a more sophisticated one now, but it is a challenge. And I think the thing that immediately came to mind was kind of sentiment inference. And maybe you mentioned propaganda. Again, AI being a double-edged sword, using those types of technologies then to create regulatory compliance or to create restrictions based on inference may become a thing, will likely become a thing.
Do we have time for one more? I think was there a woman with the striped shirt? Did you have a question? Yeah, so I think the whole conversation has been like the word kind of the responsible AI ethics conversation has been the ethos of the kind of regulatory conversations over the last couple of years. And I think people are a bit burnt out on the word ethics, but it hasn't gone away. There's certainly all of the, that is the basis of this. And that's why I think we see a lot of these human rights issues show up in these regulatory frameworks. It's why we're really for developers, I think, developing with these sort of, there are now, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 frameworks on ethical AI that are from reputable agencies that you can go, that you can look at to see different guidance on it. In general, being very thoughtful and cautious about the types of data that you're collecting, the types of products that you're releasing into the market, what the long-term effects of those could be. Unfortunately, sometimes as developers, you are the people on the cutting edge, and you're the people that know that you will have the most insight into that. And then bringing those conversations into the larger regulatory context is sort of an industry-led thing at this point. And there are many, many frameworks to reference, we could go through them, but I don't know, do you have any kind of general points on?
The big impact it's had is on how companies approach it themselves. All the international stuff that we've talked about is couched in ethical language. And while it's not having the impact at the national level yet, what we're seeing is companies adopting that immediately.
Or we hope.
Yes.
Anything else there?
I think we're good.
All right, thank you all so much for joining us
Thank you.
on this Thursday morning.
Appreciate it.